Why is it that many men, once they cross 50, don't dream of marriage anymore, but instead dream of silence, routine, and peace? This isn't bitterness, and it's not loneliness either. It's a psychological shift that happens when a man has lived enough, lost enough, and learned enough to finally choose himself. Today, we're going to unpack the real reasons men over 50 step away from marriage, not from women, but from chaos. Emotional exhaustion is one of the most powerful yet misunderstood reasons men over 50 choose peace over marriage. This exhaustion doesn't happen overnight. It builds slowly, layer by layer, through years of emotional responsibility, compromise, and unspoken expectations. Many men enter relationships with the belief that patience and silence will eventually bring harmony, but over time, constant emotional labor begins to drain them internally. In long-term relationships or marriages, men are often conditioned to suppress their emotional needs. They learn to stay quiet to avoid conflict, to tolerate dissatisfaction for the sake of stability, and to prioritize harmony over honesty. While this may keep relationships intact on the surface, internally it creates emotional depletion. Over decades, this suppression turns into fatigue, where even the idea of explaining feelings feels overwhelming. Unresolved conflicts play a major role in this exhaustion. Arguments that were never fully addressed, emotional wounds that were minimized, and repeated misunderstandings accumulate in the subconscious. Even after relationships end, the emotional residue remains. Men over 50 carry memories of conversations that went nowhere, efforts that went unnoticed, and sacrifices that were expected rather than appreciated. These experiences shape their emotional responses moving forward. With age comes emotional awareness. Men begin to recognize patterns they previously ignored. They understand how much energy it takes to constantly negotiate emotions, manage expectations, and adapt to another person's emotional world. What once felt like love now feels like continuous effort without emotional return. This awareness makes them cautious, not bitter. There is also a deep fear of emotional reinvestment. Starting a new marriage means reopening emotional doors they've already closed to protect themselves. It means risking peace for the possibility of connection. And for emotionally exhausted men, that risk feels too high. Their nervous system is no longer wired for emotional turbulence. Even small disagreements can feel disproportionately draining because the body remembers years of emotional stress. At this stage of life, emotional conservation becomes instinctive. Men begin to value calm mornings, predictable routines, and emotional neutrality. They are not chasing excitement or validation anymore. Their priority shifts to protecting what little emotional energy they have left. Marriage, if perceived as emotionally demanding, automatically feels incompatible with this need for preservation. Emotional exhaustion also changes how men view love itself. Love is no longer associated with intensity or sacrifice. Instead, it is measured by how little disturbance it brings to their inner state. Anything that threatens emotional balance feels intrusive rather than intimate. This shift doesn't make them emotionally unavailable. It makes them emotionally selective. Many men over 50 have already given the best of their emotional selves earlier in life. What remains is guarded, measured, and deeply protective. The desire for peace isn't a rejection of connection, but a response to years of emotional overextension that reshaped how they relate to intimacy, commitment, and emotional responsibility. As men cross the age of 50, their relationship with stress changes dramatically. What once felt manageable or temporary now feels intrusive and disruptive. Mental peace becomes a priority because the mind has already endured decades of emotional noise, conflict, and psychological pressure. This shift is not sudden. It is the result of prolonged exposure to emotional instability and repeated cycles of tension within relationships. Emotional drama, in psychological terms, refers to unpredictable emotional environments, frequent arguments, emotional reactions without resolution, and constant demands for validation or reassurance. For younger men, this chaos may be mistaken for passion or intensity. For older men, it registers as a threat to mental stability. Their nervous system has become less tolerant of emotional highs and lows, making peace feel more valuable than emotional stimulation. Over time, men develop a strong association between relationships and mental disturbance. Even when conflict is minor, the brain recalls past emotional upheavals and reacts defensively. This creates hyper-awareness of emotional shifts, tones, and moods. What others may see as normal relationship dynamics, men over 50 often experience as psychological disruption. Their desire for peace is rooted in self-protection rather than emotional withdrawal. Another factor is cognitive clarity. With age, men gain a clearer understanding of what affects their mental health. They notice how arguments linger in the mind, how unresolved tension affects sleep, and how emotional unpredictability impacts focus and physical well-being. Mental peace becomes essential for functioning, not a luxury. Any environment that compromises this clarity is instinctively avoided. There is also a reduced tolerance for emotional negotiation. Many men spend years navigating emotional expectations, managing reactions, and trying to maintain balance within relationships. This constant mental engagement becomes exhausting. After 50, men prefer environments where their mental state is not constantly challenged or questioned. Silence, routine, and emotional predictability feel restorative rather than empty. The desire for peace also reflects a shift in identity. Older men are less concerned with proving emotional availability or relational success. They no longer measure self-worth through relationship status. Instead, they define success by inner stability and mental freedom. Emotional drama threatens this sense of autonomy, making marriage feel less appealing if it introduces psychological strain. This preference is often misunderstood as emotional detachment. In reality, it is emotional maturity. Men over 50 understand that mental peace directly impacts physical health, decision-making, and longevity. Stress is no longer something to push through, it is something to eliminate. Relationships that require constant emotional energy feel incompatible with this stage of life. Mental peace becomes a non-negotiable requirement. It influences daily choices, social interactions, and long-term commitments. Men begin to design their lives around calmness rather than connection, not because they fear intimacy, but because they have learned that emotional drama has a long-term psychological cost that they are no longer willing to pay. As men move beyond 50, self-awareness becomes sharper and more grounded in lived experience. Years of relationships, conflicts, compromises, and personal reflection give them a clearer understanding of who they are and what they are no longer willing to tolerate. This awareness is not theoretical, it is practical and deeply internalized. It shapes how they respond to people, situations, and emotional demands. Earlier in life, many men operate from external validation. They adjust their behavior to maintain relationships, avoid conflict, or meet social expectations. Boundaries are often flexible or poorly defined because the fear of losing connection outweighs personal discomfort. With time, repeated emotional compromises reveal their cost. Men begin to recognize how often they cross their own limits in the name of love or responsibility. By 50, men are more attuned to their emotional triggers. They know which conversations drain them, which behaviors disturb their peace, and which dynamics lead to resentment. This clarity allows them to set boundaries without guilt. They no longer feel the need to explain or justify their limits. Boundaries become acts of self-respect rather than emotional defense mechanisms. Clear personal boundaries also come from understanding past mistakes. Men reflect on where they overgave, tolerated disrespect, or ignored warning signs. These realizations are not driven by regret, but by learning. With this insight, they become cautious about entering commitments that may require them to compromise their emotional well-being again. Marriage, when perceived as demanding constant adjustment, feels incompatible with these hard-earned boundaries. Self-awareness also changes how men perceive responsibility. They differentiate between healthy responsibility and emotional burden. In the past, they may have felt responsible for managing another person's emotions, happiness, or reactions. With maturity, they recognize that such dynamics are unsustainable. They prefer relationships where emotional accountability is shared rather than assumed. There is a stronger sense of autonomy at this stage. Men understand their need for solitude, routine, and personal space. These needs are no longer negotiable. Any relationship that threatens this autonomy feels intrusive. Marriage, which traditionally requires continuous emotional and logistical negotiation, can feel like an erosion of personal freedom rather than a partnership. This increased self-awareness is often mistaken for rigidity. In reality, it reflects emotional stability. Men over 50 are less reactive and more deliberate. They choose environments that align with their values and avoid those that conflict with their psychological balance. Boundaries help them maintain this alignment without constant emotional effort. Clear boundaries also protect mental and physical health. Men recognize the connection between stress, emotional strain, and aging. Preserving energy becomes a priority. They invest in relationships that respect their limits and withdraw from those that challenge them. This selective approach is not about control, but about sustainability. With heightened self-awareness, men prioritize peace, consistency, and emotional safety. They seek clarity instead of intensity and respect instead of reassurance. Marriage is no longer evaluated as a milestone, but as an emotional environment, and only environments that honor their boundaries feel worthy of consideration. The fear that influences many men over 50 is often misinterpreted as a fear of commitment. In reality, it is a fear of repetition. These men have already committed before, emotionally, financially, and psychologically. What they fear is walking back into familiar patterns that once cost them peace, stability, and self-respect. Experience, not avoidance, shapes this caution. Past relationships leave psychological imprints. Men remember how certain dynamics began with hope and gradually shifted into emotional strain. They recall compromises that felt reasonable at first, but became permanent sacrifices over time. These memories act as internal warning systems, guiding future decisions. When considering marriage again, the mind revisits these experiences automatically. Men over 50 have a heightened ability to recognize patterns. They notice similarities in communication styles, emotional expectations, and conflict behaviors early on. What younger men might dismiss as minor issues, older men interpret as indicators of long-term outcomes. This awareness creates hesitation, not because of commitment itself, but because of what commitment previously evolved into. There is also the weight of responsibility tied to past mistakes. Men often carry guilt over choices they made, staying too long, leaving too late, ignoring red flags, or overextending themselves emotionally. These reflections are not rooted in self-blame, but in accountability. With maturity, they understand how costly wrong decisions can be, especially when time feels more finite. This fear of repetition is deeply connected to emotional self-preservation. Men know that starting over requires emotional investment, vulnerability, and adaptability. Having experienced the emotional toll of failed or unfulfilling marriages, they become reluctant to expose themselves to similar outcomes. The potential emotional cost outweighs the promise of companionship. Another element is the loss of recovery time. Younger individuals believe they can always rebuild. Older men understand that recovery, emotionally and psychologically, takes longer. They are more selective because they cannot afford to spend years repairing damage caused by unhealthy dynamics. This makes them cautious, not closed. Marriage also represents permanence. For men who have already experienced how permanence can become emotional entrapment, the idea of re-entering such a structure triggers anxiety. They are not afraid of sharing life with someone. They are afraid of losing themselves again. Independence becomes a safeguard against repeating identity erosion. Societal expectations often pressure men to believe that avoiding marriage means avoiding responsibility. However, men over 50 redefine responsibility as making informed decisions that protect their well-being. They understand that saying no to marriage can be an act of wisdom rather than fear. This fear is not irrational. It is grounded in lived reality. Men remember how optimism once overruled intuition and how hope delayed necessary boundaries. With experience, intuition becomes stronger, and caution becomes a form of emotional intelligence. Choosing peace over marriage becomes a strategic decision. It reflects an understanding that repeating emotional cycles leads to the same outcomes. Men prioritize learning over longing and awareness over impulse, allowing experience to guide them away from paths they already know too well. As men move past 50, their definition of fulfillment changes. External validation loses its intensity, and internal stability takes its place. Social expectations that once shaped their decisions, marriage, family roles, and public perception, begin to feel less relevant. What matters more is how their daily life feels on the inside, not how it appears to others. Routine becomes a source of psychological safety. Simple, predictable patterns such as consistent sleep, familiar environments, and controlled schedules reduce mental strain. Men at this stage recognize how deeply routine supports emotional regulation. Disruptions that once felt manageable now feel unnecessary. Marriage, when it threatens this rhythm, is seen as a potential source of imbalance rather than enrichment. Inner calm is closely linked to years of emotional exposure. After navigating responsibilities, conflicts, and expectations for decades, men become protective of mental quiet. They notice how peace improves concentration, physical health, and emotional clarity. This awareness leads them to design their lives around minimizing chaos rather than maximizing stimulation. Social pressure does not disappear, but its influence weakens. Men over 50 are less motivated to meet societal milestones for approval. They no longer feel compelled to prove success through marital status or relational achievement. Instead, they prioritize comfort, independence, and emotional neutrality. The desire to conform gives way to the desire to function well. There is also a growing intolerance for unpredictability. Emotional fluctuations, spontaneous conflicts, or shifting expectations can disrupt the stability men work hard to maintain. They prefer environments where emotional energy is conserved. Marriage, with its inherent need for compromise and adjustment, can feel like a continuous disruption to carefully constructed calm. Men at this age often redefine success. It is no longer about accumulation or status, but about sustainability. A stable lifestyle allows them to manage stress, preserve health, and maintain mental clarity. They recognize that constant emotional engagement drains energy that could be invested in personal well-being. Social expectations often frame marriage as a source of support and companionship. However, men who have experienced the opposite become skeptical. Stability for them means emotional predictability and personal control. They are cautious of structures that introduce dependency or emotional obligation that disrupts inner balance. Routine also supports autonomy. Men value the ability to make decisions without negotiation or justification. This freedom contributes to a sense of control that enhances mental peace. Marriage, which often requires shared decision-making, can feel restrictive rather than supportive when autonomy has become essential. Inner calm becomes a personal responsibility rather than a shared outcome. Men understand that peace cannot depend on another person's behavior or mood. They prefer to create environments where calm is self-sustaining and protected from external influence. Choosing stability over social expectation reflects maturity. Men are no longer chasing approval or validation. They are preserving a way of life that supports their psychological and emotional needs, even if it contradicts traditional definitions of fulfillment. As men move beyond 50, their understanding of connection becomes more nuanced and realistic. They no longer idealize relationships as solutions to loneliness or emotional fulfillment. Instead, they seek companionship that feels light, voluntary, and emotionally balanced. The emphasis shifts from obligation to choice, from permanence to presence. Legal commitment carries psychological weight. For many men, marriage is not just a romantic bond, but a structured system involving responsibilities, expectations, and potential consequences. Having already experienced the legal and emotional complexities of marriage, they become cautious about re-entering a framework that limits flexibility. The desire is not to avoid connection, but to avoid entanglement. Emotional pressure is another critical factor. Traditional marriage often comes with implicit roles: provider, problem solver, emotional stabilizer. Men over 50 are acutely aware of how these roles impacted their mental health in the past. They prefer relationships where emotional responsibility is shared and not assumed. Companionship without pressure allows for connection without emotional overload. There is also a stronger need for autonomy. Men value the ability to maintain their routines, personal interests, and social circles without constant negotiation. Companionship that respects independence feels supportive rather than restrictive. Marriage, when perceived as requiring continuous compromise, can feel incompatible with this need for personal space. This preference reflects emotional maturity rather than avoidance. Men understand that emotional closeness does not require legal binding. They can enjoy conversation, shared experiences, and mutual respect without formal commitments. The focus is on quality of interaction rather than permanence of structure. Another aspect is risk management. Legal commitments involve financial, emotional, and logistical risks that become more significant with age. Men over 50 are more risk aware. They understand that recovery from legal or emotional conflict takes time and energy they may no longer have in abundance. Companionship without legal pressure reduces exposure to these risks. Emotional safety becomes central. Men prefer relationships where expectations are clear and manageable. Without the weight of marriage, there is less pressure to perform roles or meet ideals. This creates a space where authenticity is easier to maintain. Emotional expression becomes voluntary rather than demanded. Societal narratives often equate commitment with depth. Older men challenge this assumption. They recognize that depth comes from respect, understanding, and emotional stability rather than legal status. Companionship allows for connection without sacrificing peace. There is also a shift in how men perceive time. They are less willing to invest in structures that require constant maintenance. They choose relationships that fit into their lives rather than reshape them entirely. This integration supports emotional balance and mental clarity. Choosing companionship over marriage is not a rejection of intimacy. It is a conscious decision to engage on terms that preserve autonomy, reduce pressure, and protect emotional well-being while still allowing for meaningful human connection.